Mark asked me to talk about Baptists and just war theory, and I said, Mark, you know that Baptists are not known for having made a contribution to just war theory. He said, yeah, it'll be a short talk. Before I dive into that topic, look, we've talked quite a lot today about just war, Christian realism, Reinhold Niebuhr. Why are we emphasizing this so heavily? And I think it's worth just dwelling on that. Why do we, the speakers, the people who organize this conference, think that it's so important for you to understand some of this? And for me, I think the answer is what happened in Kabul, 2 months ago, 3 months ago. That was in my view, a dereliction of duty. It was, I think, ethically inexcusable, and it was also strategically indefensible. And I think it stemmed from both President Biden and President Trump's loss of belief in the use of the military to defend our interests and to defend our values. If 2 presidents in a row have come to that conclusion, we see a need to remind and to teach these principles of Christian realism and just war. These ideas that sometimes in this fallen world we live in, we must use force to defend ourselves, our interests, our security, and yes, our ideals as well. That to me is the big picture, and that's why we've dwelt on this so heavily. If you're interested in this stuff, you can find my effort at a Niebuhrian grand strategy in a book I wrote called American Power and Liberal Order, which is secretly a book about Reinhold Niebuhr, even though he appears only a few times in there. And Just War, I just published this year a book called Just War and Ordered Liberty. You heard a bit about the history of just war theory. That's what my book is. It's an intellectual history as well as a current application to today's world. So how do Baptists fit into this conversation? Baptists and just war theory. By reputation, just war theory is a Roman Catholic property, right? Founded, somewhat inaccurately said to be founded by St. Augustine, and the most famous texts in just war historical theology by Franciscans and Dominicans, by Suarez and Vittoria, by Thomas Aquinas. And the 20th century resurrection of just war theory was led by another Catholic, John Courtney Murray, by a Methodist, you heard about Paul Ramsey earlier today, by James Turner Johnson, who's, I believe, Disciples of Christ is his background. About the only Baptists who have engaged with just war theory are in this room, or near Baptists, I should say, some with some connection to the Baptist tradition, Mark Lebecki, Eric Patterson, and a few others. And I'd humbly put myself in that category. But in thinking about this, I think there's a story here worth telling. By looking at Baptist participation in war, you get to see 2 rival political theologies emerge, theologies of war. 2 implied just war traditions within the Baptist tradition. And these 2 traditions teach us a lot about I think, the right way to think about just war, as opposed to a kind of a holy war tradition. And they also maybe teach us something about the nature of the American experiment. So I see Baptist political theology rooted, first of all, in the historic Baptist commitment to religious freedom and disestablishment. If you're not aware, I'm here to tell you that Baptists invented religious freedom, and you're welcome. All right, do we have any Baptists here? Right, where are my Baptists? There we go. Good, there we go. So that is the cornerstone of Baptist political theology, is the idea that there's no compulsion in matters of conscience. It's because we were persecuted by the rest of you in the 17th and 18th centuries, by the Episcopalians, by the Anglicans, by the Congregationalists, and the Catholics. And so it was very near and dear to us, and it was sort of core to our thinking about politics to insist upon disestablishment. That made Baptists from the very beginning partial to republicanism, small r, republicanism, to accountable governance, to the kind of government that is devoted to the common good, the body politic, to everyone, including religious minorities, which is what Baptists were for most of our history. That's why Baptists in the British Civil War sided almost entirely with the parliamentary side, with Oliver Cromwell's government. They served in the military, they fought war for the sake of parliamentary government against what they thought was the absolutist monarchy allied with the Anglican Church in the 1640s. They were so well identified with the parliamentary cause that several of them were senior in Cromwell's government to actually sign the king's death warrant when he was executed. They themselves were then executed in turn just a few years later. Baptists participated in several plots to overthrow the monarchy in the 1670s, 1680s, and Baptists very much supported the Glorious Revolution of 1689, and they were the primary beneficiaries of the Act of Toleration, which said that you don't have to be an Anglican to be British. So it's unsurprising that a century later, Baptists were identified again almost entirely with the American Revolution, against the British king and against the established Anglican Church. You can see the natural sympathy there, as the American revolutionaries are fighting for Republican principles and then embodying the First Amendment, fighting for religious freedom. And Baptists saw a chance to advance their convictions through this revolution. George Washington wrote a letter to the United Baptist Churches in Virginia in 1789, praising Baptists for their patriotism. He says, "While I recollect with satisfaction that the religious society of which you are members, Baptists, have been throughout America uniformly and almost unanimously the firm friends to civil liberty and the persevering promoters of our glorious revolution, I cannot hesitate to believe that they will be faithful supporters of a free yet efficient general government." So from the beginning, Baptists had the reputation of being, small r, Republicans, friends of free government. That was the cornerstone of Baptist political theology, and therefore Baptist war doctrine. Wars fought to defend free government were just wars. Wars to defend free government were just wars. You saw that with the British Civil War, with the American War of Revolution. You even see it, in a weird way, on both sides of the American Civil War, as both sides tried to frame their war in terms of a just war argument for Republican principles. The Confederates, some of them, claimed that they stood in an unbroken line with the Founding Fathers, and they cast their secession and their revolution, their rebellion, in Republican terms of fighting for state sovereignty, popular sovereignty, and federalism. Of course, we know that's complete bunk, but that's what they said, and it shows that they had this idea that you had to justify war in Republican terms. The North, of course, did the same thing, saying they were fighting for the Republic and the Union, and eventually emancipation, that their war was just because they were fighting for free government and freedom for the enslaved people. Fast forward 100 years, and you can see this Republican sentiment informing Baptist thought in World War II. I'm skipping a bit because I'm going to rewind and show you the other tradition of Baptist thought on war shortly. But in World War II, Baptists and evangelicals broadly, I think, thought rightly about the war. They understood that the Allies had just cause, and they were able to pull back from crusade thinking. As one historian has said, in this time, evangelicals had, quote, no qualms about identifying the Allies with a cause of justice in the world, because they did have justice on their side. And they did still often mingle faith and patriotism, yet, quote, they did so without conflating this mission with the cause of the church. That's key to just war. They never devolved into any kind of my country, right or wrong attitude. That is key to just war, to believing that your side may be fighting for justice but is not equated with perfect justice. And that, I think, is the best legacy of Baptist thinking on warfare. Unfortunately, there's another part of the story. Baptists came to this view in World War II in reaction to the excesses of World War I and much of the previous century of thinking about war. In World War I, as some of the previous speakers have mentioned, Americans and Europeans kind of went crazy in their thinking about war. And it was, in some sense, the high point of crusade thinking about war in the United States and in Europe. Many Americans and Europeans defined the wars as the war to end all wars. It was a war to achieve righteousness. There was a lot of post-millennialists in this period. They wanted to achieve a kind of a perfect kingdom of God on earth by defeating the forces of evil. Let me quote a guy named Zane Batten, who is secretary of the Northern Baptist Convention's War Commission, said this: "This war for the destruction of injustice and inhumanity is a holy crusade and a continuation of Christ's sacrificial service for the redemption of the world." That's not just war thinking, right? And if you ever hear somebody talking about war in those terms, you should turn and you should run away, go in the opposite direction. right? That's not how we should be thinking about war. War is not a continuation of Christ's sacrificial service, and it is not a crusade to destroy injustice forever. We're not destroying the one ring of power here. Unfortunately, this has a longer tradition in the United States. It wasn't just World War I. Baptists and evangelicals could draw on almost a century of thinking along these lines. As early as the War of 1812, Americans have almost always described America as a new Israel, sort of given by God a new commission, a purpose on earth to carry out his benevolent purposes. And so as early as the War of 1812, you saw Baptists and others arguing that, again, in the words of a historian, the war with Britain was about more than maritime rights, economic concerns, or even nationalism. It was about an understanding of how God planned to use America to manifest his divine plan. Again, words of a historian of the period. America occupied a special or favored place in God's purposes. The sacred nature of the American nation meant the defense of the land was lauded as a noble enterprise. Right, so this is another example of sort of crusade thinking, not just war thinking. It's not about the principles of republicanism and liberty. It's rather the sacredness of the nation itself that makes the war just in this way of thinking about things. During the war with Mexico, a couple decades later, quote, Southern Baptists and Methodists championed that war as a straightforward crusade against Latin Catholicism, right? One of the rare instances in history in which Baptists straight up took the flag for crusade and a war for the true faith. This mid-19th century would be the kind of high tide of white Protestant nativism in American history. And so that's why it's unsurprising to see this kind of crusade thinking on both sides of the Civil War. I said just a bit ago, they both used Republican arguments, which is true. They both also used crusade arguments. More clearly, the South. The South was very explicit about founding itself on Christian principles. You read the Confederate Constitution, they call themselves a Christian nation. Southern Baptists came to argue that the defense of slavery was just because they believed it was a biblical institution. They marshaled biblical arguments to defend slavery. Southern Baptists, the SBC, was founded in 1845 to defend white Baptists' right to own slaves. Southern Baptists argued, here's a quote by Ebenezer Warren, who was pastor of First Baptist Church in Macon, Georgia, in 1861. He said, slavery forms a vital element of the divine revelation to man. And so South Carolina Baptists, a couple years later, in 1863, in the middle of the war, they said this, Northerners assume that slavery is a sin and therefore ought to be abolished. We contend it's a scriptural institution. The very nature of the contest takes the point in dispute out of the category of politics and delegates it to the sphere of Christianity. We are really contending for the precepts of religion. So again, there you have Southern Baptists very clearly describing the American Civil War as a religious war, a holy war to defend their version of the true faith, which for them included slavery. The North was not wholly innocent of this kind of thinking, though it clearly had just cause. As some other speakers have said, that's only one criterion in just war. You also have to have right intention. And it does seem, historical evidence points, that some Northerners, Northern Baptists included, maybe lacked that right intention and began to feel as if the war was a holy crusade, particularly after Lincoln announced emancipation. Another quote here. The adoption of emancipation occurred alongside the transformation of the conflict from limited war to total war, even holy war. Because, as this historian says, Northern clergy sanctified in the most explicitly religious terms both the Northern cause and the United States itself. So again, the North had just cause. But that does not mean that it was thinking about the war in the right terms. You can fight a just war and think about it wrongly and have wrong intention. And it does seem as if the North maybe as well gave in to some of these crusading impulses by telling itself that because it had justice, it was righteous. And it itself, the Union itself, became sanctified. And it gave birth to a kind of American nationalism infused with Christian rhetoric. So you have these two traditions of just war thinking among Baptists. What I would call a real just war tradition, war for Republican principles, and a kind of a crusade tradition, where Baptists, like many others, have fallen prey to fighting wars for the true faith, as they saw it. That may explain why Baptists did not play a role in the 20th century revival of just war thinking that you've heard about. The two most famous Baptists of the mid-20th century, Billy Graham, Martin Luther King Jr., they did think and talk about war, but they didn't do so in just war terms. Billy Graham was a very ardent Cold Warrior and a supporter of the war in Vietnam up until the very end, when he changed his mind. And Martin Luther King Jr. was a pacifist. He gave a famous speech in 1967 in which he announced his opposition to the war in Vietnam. But neither of them held to their stances in just war terms. Billy Graham actually kind of came close to sort of crusade language. His biographer has said that Billy Graham, he preached on the gospel and he preached on anti-communism. Those are the two things he preached on the most, right? The only thing he preached about more often than anti-communism was the gospel itself. And the way he described the Soviet Union really verged on crusade language sometimes. Billy Graham wrote and sent a letter to President Nixon in 1971, I think, in which Billy Graham outlined his own plan for how to win the war in Vietnam. And a biographer has looked at this letter and said that at least one element of it, Billy Graham advocated carpet bombing civilian infrastructure, which is not consistent with just war principles, just so you know. Right. So there's an example of Billy Graham thinking through war and not benefiting from the just war principles and doing so in a way that really kind of violated what we would consider to be a just way of waging war. And Martin Luther King, for his part, when he described his opposition to the war in Vietnam, he described it in sort of straightforwardly pacifist terms. He marched down the line. He explained why war is wrong. He, as a Nobel laureate at the time, he couldn't support war. He thought it distracted attention from the civil rights movement, and on and on. He did have a few arguments in there about that could be construed in just war terms, but I think he applied them inconsistently. So again, the two most famous Baptists, mid-20th century, no just war thinking to speak of. And I think that is a sort of a legacy of maybe the Baptists' lack of consistency in thinking about war over the centuries. You finally start to see some Baptist engagement with and appreciation of the just war tradition, really starting with the end of the Cold War, a little bit beforehand. A guy named Carl F.H. Henry, he started to in the 1960s. But it really comes to fruition after the Cold War when you see figures like Richard Land, Daniel Heimbach, these are all Baptists, Bruce Ashford, and Al Mohler have all started to use the just war language. There was a debate between Daniel Heimbach and Richard Land about the Iraq War, which I think is the very first time in history that two Baptist theologians have argued about war in just war terms. And that happened in like 2003. So that gives you some sense of the Baptist contribution here. With all that said, I want to make to you an argument that the Baptist tradition, the Baptist political theology, is an almost perfect fit for just war thinking. And in fact, makes a distinctive contribution to it in a way that perhaps other denominations have not been able to. I think we have insights to offer, is what I'm saying. My friend John Askinas is going to talk about Anglicanism in a bit, but I'm going to hold to my guns that Baptists have something to offer here. The best of Baptist political theology, as reflected in our lived experience in wartime, is not only aligned with the Christian just war tradition, I do think that it is actually a distinctive, organic, and positive contribution to it. The doctrine of just war is a near perfect fit with Baptist political theology. I think it might actually be a better fit with Baptist political theology than many other church traditions from which it sprang, because it's precisely the Baptist emphasis on the separation of church and state, which lays the strongest groundwork for waging wars for the common good and not for the true faith or the true ideology. It lays the strongest safeguards against crusades and wars for religion. I think Baptists, more than any other tradition, have emphasized that conversion must come from a free, conscious, rational movement of the soul, that there is indeed no compulsion in matters of faith, no compulsion of the conscience, and thus there is no role for the state in matters of religion. That's, of course, the bedrock for our doctrine of religious freedom and disestablishment, but it is also the same grounds on which we reject the doctrine of holy war and affirm the doctrine of just war. The just war doctrine comes to the clearest definition in contrast to the false doctrine of holy war, which was widely prevalent during the wars of religion. Advocates of the just war doctrine rejected the idea of holy war. war to defend the true faith, for the same reason that Baptists reject state compulsion in matters of faith at home. State power must be kept separate from inner conscience. If the state can't compel in matters of conscience at home, neither should it do so on the international stage. And Baptists, more than others, understood this doctrine at home. And while Baptists were not at the forefront of applying it abroad, I think we can see the consistency between the two. Just war is ideally suited to the architecture of Baptist political theology, so to speak. Its emphasis on disestablishment. Just war is the disestablishment of the church from warfare. Just war is the disestablishment of the church from warfare. Of course, we'll still have things to say about war. We'll still try to hold the state accountable. We'll still try to teach about justice, but we will not expect the state to wage wars on our behalf, on behalf of the church, nor for our parochial benefit. Finally, I think Baptist emphasis on republicanism, small r, can be seen as an authentic development in just war thinking, one that is distinctive to tradition but a genuine contribution. Older just war thinking tended to describe war as just when it vindicated the common good, principles of peace, justice, and order. As a Baptist, I would add liberty. Peace, justice, order, and liberty, which, when we institutionalize it, we call the institutions of republicanism and ordered liberty. And that means Baptists have an answer to the key questions of just war. When is war just? The violent disruption of ordered liberty is the injury in response to which force may be used and war may be justly waged. What does justice require? Justice requires the vindication and restoration of ordered liberty in, through, and after warfare. Thank you very much. Do we have time for questions? We do.
Questions? There are a lot of Baptists in the room.
Hello, my name is Natalie. I'm from Liberty University. So we had this term, ordered liberty, kind of repeated right at the end of your talk. So I guess this is a two-part question. One, how do we define ordered liberty and know that our version of ordered liberty is good? As well as, what do you think our responsibility is after warfare? What does that look like?
Thank you for the question, Natalie. In answer to the second question, what are responsibilities after war, I'm just going to refer you to Eric Patterson's book, At War's End. He wrote a whole book on it. It's the best book I've read on that subject. And he talks about the need for order, justice, conciliation, right? What's our obligation after war? It is to work for order, justice, conciliation. Those are good principles for thinking about justice after war, or our obligations after war. Okay, ordered liberty. In the garden, God makes Adam and Eve, puts them in the garden, and he says, tend and keep the garden. Tend and keep. Anybody ever done any gardening? Any gardening? Okay. So what do you do when you garden? There's the raw stuff of nature. This is mess, it's a chaos, right? And the gardener has to impose some order on it by making the rows, building the trellis, tilling the soil, planting the seeds in order, and giving it water. So there's a little bit of imposition of order there. And then you stand back and let nature take its course. You give it liberty. That, I think, is a good recipe for bringing flourishing to this creation. Order and liberty together. That's what brings flourishing. That's good parenting advice. And it's good advice if you're a boss, if you're ever in charge of anything, both order and liberty. So I stand by those principles as objective, transcendent, transcultural, timeless principles of justice and order and peace. What it will look like in any particular application, there's going to be a lot of different applications of it, a lot of different institutionalizations of it. Ours here in the United States, I think, is pretty good, but I do a few things different, right? The First Amendment is not divinely inspired, but pretty darn good, right? I think that's a really good institutionalization of order and liberty on matters of conscience and state and free speech and all that. So I'm not really answering your question. I'm just saying, yeah, it's going to look different, but the principles, I would argue, are timeless.
Hi, my name's Catherine. I'm also from Liberty, and I had a question on how asymmetric warfare relates to just war theory. How do those two correlate with each other?
So are you asking how do we fight against an asymmetric enemy, like an insurgent or terrorist?
Yeah, so like
Yeah.
with insurgencies and terrorism and the war on terror, how does just war theory apply to that?
Yeah. Well, it does apply in a number of ways. Number one, asymmetric enemies by definition are smaller, less powerful, right? And so there's maybe a slightly greater burden on us to exercise the restraint necessary to maintain proportionality, right? You don't respond to a terrorist with a nuclear bomb. Right? That's immoral. It's also strategically done because you're going to cause a backlash. So that's one way in which just war principles would apply. I think there's a greater burden to exercise some restraint there. There's another way, and it gets back to this question about justice after war. How do you defeat an asymmetric movement like jihadist terrorism? That's a harder question, and I may be a minority on this, because I think the answer is we have an obligation insofar as we are going to engage in this war. If we're going to fight against jihadists who have attacked us in this very city and in New York, the war is not about killing bad guys. That is not what the war is about. And I think Joe Biden gets this completely wrong. Right? He said, we got bin Laden, time to go home. That means the war is just about killing bad guys, and I can't defend that. You kill people not as an end in of itself, but only so that you have the opportunity to build justice and peace, which is what we did not do in Afghanistan or Iraq. We did not build justice and peace there. Now, we can have an argument about why we failed to do that. I think we should have done more peacekeeping, more reconstruction, development, all that kind of stuff. But to me, that's what it would take to wage this war justly. Fight the war in Afghanistan with the clear intention and with the resources required to usher in some kind of justice or peace, which we obviously failed to do. Make sense?
I'm Jenna, also from Liberty. Why do you think Baptists didn't engage with just war tradition if it's such a good fit with Baptist theology?
Yeah, great question. Just like the early Christians didn't really think about political power much because they were a persecuted minority and they didn't have power for the first 3 centuries. Similarly, Baptists were a minority and they were persecuted, they didn't have power. So they didn't have a reason to think about warfare or what to do with the state power. They were more concerned with how to limit state power to stop being persecuted. Insofar as they had the chance to participate in war, they just chose the side of republicanism and liberty. I think that's probably the best answer. You see, as Baptists are more mainstreamed within American culture, and they're not, y'all know Baptist history, right? They're generally the lower classes. But as Baptists become more sort of mainstream, that's when you start to see more Baptist engagement with this kind of thinking.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Christopher Parr from Southern Seminary. You mentioned how crusade thinking's taken on a role in Baptist life, and I think in recent decades it's taken on the form of culture war. So is there a way that just war thinking can help us avoid a crusade-type posture towards a time when Baptists and people of all faiths are experiencing cultural pressure?
Somebody has written this article. It was an undergraduate thesis I looked at. I'm hesitant to apply the just war framework to something that does not literally involve killing. That said, with the culture war, which is a real thing, I think it's still helpful to be reminded to wage even that culture war, a political, cultural conflict, with magnanimity and grace. Right? As Christians, we're not exempt from the requirement to let your speech always be gracious, right? Because out of the heart, the mouth speaks. To beware of the tongue, because it is so when we wage the culture war, we certainly ought to do so consistent with what we might say are just war principles of discrimination, proportionality. I think that's not necessarily the best way of putting it, but I am saying as we fight the culture war, let's do so with right intention, with love towards our enemies. I'm troubled sometimes by what I see on both sides. of an effort to mock, deride, denigrate, destroy the reputations of others. I think those are probably unhelpful ways of carrying on whatever political advocacy you want to carry on. Yeah.
Thanks, Dr. Miller. My question revolves around this passage, this line of Jesus in John 18, where he says, he's in front of Pilate, and he says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest." And I've always been interested in that verse, and I'm wondering if you could explain if and how that relates to just war theory, and especially how you were saying the church not being separate from the state when it comes to war, or kind of this idea of crusade. Could you give like the...
Thank you. That is a perfect expression of why holy war is wrong, right? Jesus says, "My kingdom's not of this world." We're not called to fight wars or build governments to institutionalize Jesus' rule. We're simply not called or given authority to establish theocracies or to force anyone to agree with us religiously. So that is why we're not holy warriors, and we never should be. That's separate from what Paul says in Romans chapter 13 when he says God has ordained that the government exists. He's given the ruler a sword. He's not given the ruler a sword in vain, and it is a divine ordinance that the government exists to uphold some sense of order and justice in this world. So those things exist side by side. Government exists with coercive power by God's ordinance, and we are not to use it to try to build God's kingdom.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.